Hi there dphog. Today we are going to talk about foreground objects and my enjoyment of foreground objects in my work. Okay, so before we get into all of the specific reasons why I use foreground objects, I think there is one global reason. I find that they make images infinitely more interesting. A dull image, that is. It just tends to help an image along. In an otherwise very flat and one-dimensional space, it seems to create a little bit of interest in many different ways. My only word of advice is please don't overuse the technique. Don't go and attempt to put it into every single image that you're creating from here on. Use it wisely and use it correctly, and you'll really enjoy it and start incorporating it into your work, and you'll see a big improvement. Okay, so getting right into it, the first reason, and probably my favorite reason for using foreground objects, is for voyeuristic intent. Now, I think it was the great intellectual Susan Sontag said that all photography by its very nature is voyeuristic. We are taking a camera and we are observing a lot of the time silently subjects on the other side of the camera. So by placing a foreground object in between the camera and the subject, I do find that a lot of the time this distance tends to enhance story. When the story and the mood calls for it, calls for this infusion of voyeuristic intent, it is a very, very powerful tool in your photography. What this foreground object will do is creates distance, makes them somewhat unreachable, and I think that builds a lot of story into your image. So the second reason why I like to use foreground objects is for the purposes of it being a compositional element. Now, there's a few aspects to this. Maybe in the one instance, you have an area of your image that just doesn't make sense to you. It's not really negative space, it's just dead space. So a foreground object might just help to dilute this area that you're not quite sure of, that you can't quite figure out compositionally. Staying with composition, what it might do also is help to force focus in an image. If there's a group of people sitting on a couch and a bunch of stuff next to them, so what do? Take a foreground object, place it compositionally in relation to what's going on in your image, and that becomes a blur and it becomes softer, so it helps to force the focus into the area of the image that you want the viewer to concentrate on. Okay, and then the third compositional aspect is that quite often I find, especially in magazine shoots, that the format of the page doesn't allow for the ends of limbs to get into a shot. Obviously, a lot of the time, of course, it works out just fine, but sometimes I just find that there's no way to get round cutting off a foot, cutting off a hand, chopping into the elbow, little aspects like that where you need to fill the page, but then when you're filling the page correctly, everything looks great, but then there's a foot that's getting chopped off, or a hand or something like that. So by using a foreground object, a lot of people regard this compositional sin as one of the cardinal sins that you can commit in photography, and by using foreground objects and just softening it so that the limb sort of disappears within the frame and we never really see an end to it, I just find that it helps to excuse the sin somewhat. And a lot of the time with very pleasing effects, people don't even notice that something was chopped off. Okay, so the third and my least used reason for foreground objects is to adjust exposure. Now this is more of a trick than anything else, and it's kind of more of an Instagram kind of effect. I don't often use it professionally, but when I'm messing around, taking happy snaps, enjoying time and just creating random memories, I quite often find myself controlling the light with my hand, where there might be a bright sky up in the shot. So I'll just bring my hand in and I'll adjust the exposure with the edges of my fingers and snap away quite happily. And it's really cool. It's the silly little magician's trick that wows all of the friends. The other thing that I'll often do with that is when I'm on a shoot, I'll pick off a branch from a tree, just a little bush of leaves, and I'll often be shooting like this, just trying to guard certain areas of the image with this little branch. Obviously, doing it in that way, it also infuses probably a green haze into the one corner of the image, which creates a little bit of a romantic atmosphere or nostalgic atmosphere in some of the shots. Okay, then my last reason in this video, which was probably the first reason that I started using this, was Undefined Effects. Now, by Undefined Effects, it'll be a pattern of some sort that completely closes off the front of the lens. So you'll never over the image see a specific area of blur, but over the entire image there will be a certain pattern created or a certain reaction to this pattern held in front of the lens and your mid and foreground objects. Now what you'll find is that it'll bring certain objects that aren't supposed to be in focus will come slightly into focus, others will go out of focus and be blurred. So it's really an effects based thing that you'll have to play around with a little bit to get used to it, but it's a hell of a lot of fun and it produces some really interesting results. So lastly, in closing off this video, what I just want to speak about is that if you go and watch a film and pay attention with a good cinematographer, pay attention to their use of foreground, midground and background. It is very extensively employed in film, but somehow never seemed to filter through to stills and to photography. Now I don't know whether this is lack of budget, laziness, but good cinematographers make extensive use of foreground, midground and background. And what this does is that in an otherwise two-dimensional projected image or image perceived, it helps, I think, to bring back to us the reality of the world that we exist in, where everything is three-dimensional. So by adding these layers and planes of focus, I think it sort of normalizes the image and makes us a little bit more comfortable with the image, more used to existing within that space. We can relate to it a little bit better. So pay attention to that and start using it selectively in your own work. It's been a great pleasure bringing you this video today, dphog, and please subscribe if you like what we're doing and help us keep up the good work for you. See you next time. Cheers.